Don't buy into the surface-level narrative about Venezuela, Maduro, or his sudden appearance in a new tracksuit. In the early hours of January 3, 2026, at exactly 2:01 a.m., U.S. helicopters landed at a military installation outside Caracas. Less than half an hour later, Nicolás Maduro, a leader who had survived years of sanctions, unrest, and diplomatic isolation, was in handcuffs and being transported to an American aircraft carrier. But what most analysts failed to understand is this: the operation had very little to do with Maduro himself. It wasn't really about narcotics trafficking either, despite the official charges. This was about China. After years of studying global power struggles, I can tell you that what unfolded in Venezuela is not an isolated incident. It marks the opening move of a much broader confrontation. Welcome to what is now being called the Donroe Doctrine. And if you think this is just Trump playing to his base, posturing for political theater, you're missing the bigger picture. What's happening now may prove to be the most significant shift in American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. While the United States was spending blood and treasure in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine, a silent transformation took place much closer to home. China didn't invade Latin America. It did something far more effective. It bought it. In the year 2000, China's trade with Latin America stood at roughly $12 billion, barely a blip. By 2024, that number had exploded to $518 billion. That's a 40-fold increase in just over 2 decades. Today, China is the largest trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and Argentina. In practical terms, that means Beijing has displaced Washington in every major South American economy that truly matters. But trade statistics only tell part of the story. The real transformation is happening on the ground. In November 2024, China inaugurated the port of Changsay in Peru, a $3.5 billion deep-water megaport, majority owned by COSCO, a Chinese state shipping giant. The facility features fully automated cranes capable of handling vessels too large for the Panama Canal. This port establishes a direct maritime corridor between Shanghai and South America, bypassing North American ports entirely. A journey that once took 35 days now takes just 23, cutting shipping costs by 20%. China's ambassador called it the Shanghai of South America. Peru's transport minister wants it to become the Singapore of Latin America. And that's only the beginning. China and Brazil are now exploring a transcontinental railway linking Changsay to Brazil's Atlantic coast, creating an alternative to the Panama Canal itself, a Chinese-controlled corridor running across South America. But ports are only the visible layer of this strategy. The invisible layer is even more consequential. China's State Grid Corporation has poured $12.5 billion into Brazil's power sector, constructing ultra-high voltage transmission lines stretching more than 2,000 kilometers. They now operate critical segments of the electrical grid supplying São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. If you live in Brazil's largest cities, there's a good chance your electricity depends on Chinese infrastructure. In 2025, State Grid secured a $3.6 billion contract for another 1,500-kilometer power line connecting Brazil's renewable-rich northeast to industrial centers in the south. By 2030, China plans to invest an additional $40 billion in Brazil's energy network. Then there's lithium. The so-called lithium triangle, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, contains 60% of the world's lithium reserves. This is the metal that powers electric vehicles, the backbone of the green transition, and the foundation of companies like Tesla. Bolivia alone holds more lithium than Chile. Until recently, Bolivia's state lithium company had multi-billion-dollar deals with China's CATL, the world's largest battery producer, and Russia's Uranium One. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Without South American lithium, there is no American EV industry. There is no green transition. Ford, GM, Tesla, they all depend on these resources, and China has been locking them down. From Washington's perspective, this is not just commerce. It is a strategic threat. To America's national security establishment, China has built a resource extraction empire in the U.S. strategic backyard, while Washington looked the other way. The Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old principle that the Western Hemisphere falls under American influence, has been dismantled not by tanks or missiles, but by shipping terminals and power lines. And Trump has decided that era is over. After Maduro's capture, Trump declared that the Monroe Doctrine had been surpassed and replaced. They now call it the Donroe Doctrine, he said. This wasn't just bravado. It was the articulation of a new American grand strategy. Here's what the Donroe Doctrine means in practice. First, the Western Hemisphere is now America's top strategic priority. Trump's December 2025 national security strategy devotes more pages to Latin America than to Europe or Asia. It explicitly labels non-hemispheric powers, China, Russia, and Iran, as existential threats. The strategy commits the U.S. to using financial and technological leverage to pressure countries into rejecting Chinese investment. In plain terms, align with Washington or face consequences. Second, this is not a diplomatic doctrine. It is economic coercion. In April 2025, Trump announced Liberation Day, imposing a baseline 10% tariff on nearly all imports. But the real weapon is secondary sanctions. Countries that continue doing business with China face escalating penalties. The message to Latin America is simple: trade with China or trade with the United States, not both. Mexico has already felt the pressure. Under U.S. demands, President Claudia Sheinbaum's government is advancing legislation imposing tariffs as high as 50% on Chinese goods to prevent Beijing from using Mexico as a backdoor into the American market. Third, military force is explicitly on the table. Venezuela proved this is not rhetoric, and Venezuela was only the beginning. Trump's team has expanded the geographic scope of the Monroe Doctrine from Greenland to Antarctica. New military deployments are underway across the Caribbean, Central America, and the Pacific approaches. Secretary of State Marco Rubio traveled to Panama within weeks of taking office, delivering an ultimatum: reduce Chinese influence over the canal or face American retaliation. Panama complied. The Hong Kong firm operating ports at both ends of the canal is now selling its assets to a U.S.-led consortium, and Panama has withdrawn from China's Belt and Road Initiative. Fourth, the carrot and stick approach. Bolivia's newly elected president, Rodrigo Paz, is canceling lithium contracts with China and Russia and seeking closer ties with Washington. In return, the U.S. is offering IMF credit, development bank financing, and technology transfers. Argentina's Javier Milei has emerged as Trump's closest ally in the region. When Trump threatened Panama, Milei publicly backed U.S. control of the canal. He was the only regional leader who refused to sign a statement defending Panamanian sovereignty. The hemisphere is being sorted: allies and adversaries, dollar or yuan. Now come the pressure points. Mexico is the front line. Chinese companies have been building shell factories in Mexico to exploit USMCA loopholes. Trump is demanding security cooperation that would effectively give U.S. forces operational authority inside Mexico. Cartels, fentanyl, and migration are the justification. The real issue is supply chain decoupling from China. If Mexico refuses, Trump has threatened to designate cartels as terrorist organizations, a move that would legally justify U.S. military operations on Mexican soil. Brazil is a different problem. It's a major power in its own right, the world's 9th largest economy, home to the Amazon, vast oil reserves, and agricultural exports vital to both China and the U.S. President Lula refuses to choose sides. In 2025, he stood beside Xi Jinping, announcing billions in new Chinese investments. BYD is building EV factories. State Grid is expanding Brazil's grid, but Brazil also hosts massive U.S. investment. Trump slapped 40% tariffs on Brazilian agriculture. They were later partially rolled back, but the message was clear. Argentina holds another strategic wild card, Ushuaia, the only deepwater port capable of servicing Antarctic operations. China is expanding its Antarctic footprint. The U.S. now claims Antarctica under the expanded Monroe framework. Then there's Nicaragua. In 2024, Daniel Ortega revived plans for a 445-kilometer interoceanic canal, a rival to Panama, financed by China, capable of handling megaships the Panama Canal cannot, a permanent alternative to U.S. maritime dominance. The price tag, up to $80 billion. Only China could build it. Why won't China simply walk away? Because it can't. China's economy depends on Brazilian iron ore, Chilean copper, Bolivian lithium, Venezuelan oil. These are existential inputs. If Washington forces Latin America to choose, China faces slow economic strangulation. That is unacceptable to Beijing. And China will respond. Hours after the Venezuela operation, China conducted military drills simulating a blockade of Taiwan's largest ports. The message was unmistakable. This is the escalation trap. America acts in its hemisphere. China acts in its region. Each move justifies the next. This is not a single crisis. It is a structural struggle over the arteries of the global economy. Either China keeps access to Latin America or America restores hemispheric dominance. Both cannot coexist, and Latin America is now the battlefield. Venezuela chose wrong. Maduro now sits in a Manhattan jail cell. Panama folded. Bolivia pivoted. Argentina aligned. But Brazil will resist. Mexico will hesitate. Cuba and Nicaragua will defy. History shows what happens when great powers collide. Smaller nations pay the price. The Donroe Doctrine ends neutrality. The age of multi-alignment is over. America is back in its backyard, and it is angry. China believed trade would be protected by international law. Venezuela proved that assumption was conditional. The rules have changed. The game has changed. Latin America is caught between two giants, and the pen is no longer in its hands. This story is only beginning. The opening shots have been fired, the battle lines are drawn, and the ghost of the Monroe Doctrine is back, with a new name and an appetite.